This is Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair. Resilience is all about making a choice when the unexpected hits you so that you can move forward. Unlocked, this show is about preparing you so that choice is easier because we have opened possibilities. Again, so that when you are hit with the unexpected, you can move on. Today, we're going to be talking about possibilities. You know, I always cringe when somebody says to me, Madelyn, that was great, but now I'm a person who actually loves getting feedback. Good or bad, it gives you information that helps you decide how you'll do something in the future. More of the good, less of the bad. It's such a different experience when the person says, Madelyn, that was great. And my reaction is that this person has thought about what I've done and wants to help me. In the end, they may be giving me the same feedback, and it feels so much easier to receive that second way. You know, we live in a country that loves things to be either or, but, or and. Yes or no, blue or red, up or down, left or right. You get the point. Yet in all of this, if we really think about it, each of these comparisons might be expressed as a continuum on a scale of 1 to 10. Are you a strong right, a medium right, or so little right that you're actually left? When we have to make choices in business, our careers, or in life in general, it's so easy to consider two options, presumably picking the best one. Often, either choice would move us forward, just in a slightly different way. Of course, not all choices are like this, but I think more than we think are. Life is simply more complex than we would prefer it to be because, you know, when things are complex, our brains have to work harder to make the best choice. Today's guest is going to be exploring these in this session called Living in the Both and Land. And I want to introduce you to, as soon as I can get my cursor, there it is. I want to introduce you to Bruce Waltuck. He's an award-winning change leader, a facilitator, a consultant, and teacher. He has co-created and led the successful employee involvement and process improvement union management partnership initiative at the U.S. Department of Labor, where he then helped negotiate the first fully integrative collective bargaining agreement in the U.S. federal sector. I'll tell you, Bruce, I'm already impressed.
You're
But
very kind.
he's made other unique contributions. But after an encounter, whoops, my voice is going, so I think I'm going to pause and let Bruce come in and talk and introduce himself while I take some water.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Madelyn, for this invitation and for this opportunity to be with you. And just by way of a little bit of context, I was just a cog in the machine, as it were, at the U.S. Department of Labor. I was a frontline investigator enforcing wage payment laws and worker protection laws. And at the same time, we were hearing about, and this was a long time ago, this was in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when the quality improvement movement was really taking hold in America's industries. And my boss and I were really excited about this, but we couldn't get permission to do it. And it was literally 8 years later when that permission came. And it came in the context of a typical adversarial labor management relationship. And there was a confluence there of opportunity to do improvement of quality and business output and so on, productivity, and do it in conjunction with a collaborative venture that would shift the relationships of the union and management factions. And there's a lot more to it that gets us into both and land, but this is actually a starting point for me.
Oh, outstanding. Well, let me just finish some of the things that you have done, which I think it's important for our audience to know. You are currently a member of the board of directors of the Plexus Institute. It's an extraordinary organization that has explored the meaning of complexity in our lives and work. And Bruce, I really can't remember the first time we met, but
No, I was thinking about that.
yeah, it must have been so long ago. It's in the mists of time, as they say.
Precisely.
But I can
It
tell
had
you
to be Plexus related.
it had to be Plexus related. You're absolutely right. But I can tell you to the audience, he's full of energy and ideas. And I have been so looking forward to today's conversation.
Oh, lovely. Likewise.
Good. Well, now, in reading through your bio, I noticed that you began your pursuit of complexity in 1998.
Yeah.
After achieving some major accomplishments, which I talked about, today your work appears to build on complexity, chaos, and creativity. And I love to see how people's paths, take unusual twists and turns. Would you share with the audience how you were introduced to complexity and why it seems to have taken you over?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a story that I love to tell because it was an unexpected, literally life-changing moment. And when I visited, I was on a family trip in San Francisco at that time. And I had been, as I mentioned earlier, leading the U.S. Department of Labor's nationwide business process improvement and employee involvement initiative, and with significant success. But we were finding at the same time that there were managers and people in different locations who saw collaboration as a threat to their power. They were old school control types and power types.
They're still around.
Absolutely, they are. We know some of them, and so at this trip, it's a wonderful tourist town for walking around. But what do you do when you have your 11-year-old son with you and it's a rainy day? We went to a wonderful hands-on science museum called the Exploratorium. The featured exhibit that day happened to be called Turbulent Landscapes. These were exhibits that were interactive, experiential, and co-created by scientists and artists. And I was playing with, and it sounds quite simple, it was about a 3-foot tall pendulum with a magnet at the end. And it was over a table that had a lot of little magnets that you could move as you chose and stack them to either repel or attract the magnet on the pendulum. And when we let go of a pendulum, we expect, that grandfather clock, just that regularity, but I let go of that pendulum, and you could buy small tabletop versions. I actually bought a couple that day in their gift shop, and I use it in classes and the like. You can find YouTube videos too, actually, of this thing. And what it does when you let it go, you expect it's just going to be this, but this thing suddenly just veered all over, and it would stay at one magnet for a bit and then jump over here. And it was as if some unseen force was controlling this in a way that I didn't know about. Well, it was just the laws of physics, but in that moment where my life changed is I suddenly saw me. I was the one on the end of that pendulum. And these were the people that I had to interact with every day, the various pushes and pulls of people's ideas and agendas and interpretations of sense and meaning of the world and what we should do, and don't do it this way, do it that way. And I'm not going to go along with what the Secretary of Labor said just because you tell me. I'm going to, whatever it was. And so I picked up some literature that they had there for teacher resources, and I was on my way. I went to my nearest bookstore when I got home and just started everything I could find, and discovered Plexus 2 years later, and I was on my way. So it just literally did change my life in terms of how I thought about the dynamics of the work we all do and the lives we all live every moment.
But the amazing thing about your story is how you saw the connection between that pendulum and your life and the forces that draw us in different directions, unexpectedly, expectedly.
Oh, yes.
Great story. When I hear that our problems today are more complex, my response is, I'm sorry, life has always been complex.
Absolutely.
But anybody who's raised a child knows it's complex, and it gets more complex as the older they get. Anybody who's actually gardened knows the gardening is a
Ah,
complex thing.
we'll come back to that.
Okay. But I think that right now it would be interesting if we could just sort of tease out a little bit more
Sure.
of what we mean by this thing called complexity.
Great question and point. So, what is this about, and why is suddenly people, we seem to hear about it more and be more aware of, and it seems to be impacting us more. And my take on that is exactly as you said. There are things in this world, as I tell folks, there's just different kinds of situations that we humans experience. If you and I have a flat tire, just about everybody, even if we've never changed a flat tire ourselves before, we know what it is and we know what to do to fix it. And either we do it or our friend does it or we call AAA, it gets done the same way every time. If you and I needed a root canal, I couldn't do it for you and you couldn't do it for me. And maybe a few of the oral surgeons we would talk to might have slightly different views of our x-ray and what to do, but we would get it done with a high degree of predictability. What they tell us now is going to work when they do it. But there's other stuff that just doesn't fall into that in our relationships. I teach social entrepreneurship, businesses seeking to solve social problems. And we talk about, what about those homeless people who are huddled at night under that bridge? And what if we get a shelter to house and clothe them? And there's a story that we look at that we have unexpected. We don't know all the details of who they are or how they got there, or why their lives are that way. World peace, look at Ukraine. What is all of that all about? And so these things have many interacting moving parts, and the people involved are continuously, we're impacting one another and being impacted by one another all the time, just as you and I are doing right now in our conversation and communication. So the complexity stuff has always been there. I think we've had centuries of like Newtonian science. We expect the magnet and the pendulum to just do what it does. The lever will push the thing and the change will happen in our business. And if I hire that consultant who says they did it over there, they're going to do it over here and it's going to work. Well, it doesn't always work that way. As we know, there was a Wall Street Journal famous, often quoted story that something like 75% of change initiatives fail from consulting and all of this kind of stuff. So I think that we're suddenly seeing getting more of a sense of complexity because of the transitions that happen. There's a sort of a sharp cliff, as it were, between things that appear to be stable and constant. And then when something comes along, COVID, pretty obvious example these last couple of years, and we suddenly go over the cliff into kind of turmoil and uncertainty and chaos and ambiguity, and nobody knows what to do. No expert can help us. So then what do we do? And that's really where I'm going to pause. And to me, that's just sort of the intro part of this. Complexity's always been there. We're noticing it more than ever. Now more than ever, we need the insights, understanding, and skills to help us get the best results we can.
Your stories really set the stage for what I really wanted to explore, which is this aspect of what happens in business where we really do want to have the expected happen. To me, it's one of the challenges that I certainly have faced in running my own company for the last 30 some years. And before that, as the division chief at the World Bank, I mean, you want to have a certain predictability. I wonder if you would just explore this a little bit more, because
Sure.
There are lots of options every time.
Yeah, I'm just jotting down a couple of notes about things I want to mention. So two things, these are terms that I sort of coin and use to describe what I've seen in my career, decades of doing this same kind of stuff, working with all kinds of organizations and presenting literally around the world, which I've been fortunate to do. And what I have seen again and again and again is what I call the single biggest mistake that business managers and leaders and people make. And the single biggest mistake is treating what are in fact complex situations and challenges as if they were some technical, complicated thing like the root canal that will bring in the expert and the expert knows what to do. And we will know prospectively before we do it, the expert advice is going to work.
I have to
Go ahead. Oh, yeah, sure.
interject. So often we have in our literature, in our conversations, referred to organizations as machines, as
There
if
you go.
they are predictive.
As if, exactly. No, and systems theory in part and other things that have been very dominant in
Mhm.
management and consulting literature and practice for decades are built on this Newtonian concept. Now, we've done a lot. It's not to say that Newton was wrong. We went to the moon, where we do all kinds of things with science and technology. What you and I are doing right now wouldn't be possible without the technologies and the science. But, and especially in human interaction, that's not the way everything is. And it's never been the way everything is. And so we've come, as business evolved, as the modern industrial and organizational era began couple centuries ago, whatever it is, and we had to organize and we had to do things in certain ways to get repeat and consistent quality and productivity and effectiveness in our businesses, which is what everybody wants: profitability, effectiveness, all that. We have tended to overlook and look away from, frankly, the true complexities of many of the challenges we do face, whether it's teamwork and collaboration, or, when suddenly, what happens when, people aren't mining coal anymore and you're a coal mining town in Pennsylvania or West Virginia. And I have friends who have experienced this, third generation families of coal miners. And now what? They're gonna kind of literally all pushed off that edge from the stability of their lives into the turmoil of that unknown, and in a sense unknowable. So the single biggest mistake that we see is doing that, treating the complex as if it wasn't. And it's for, and again, these are terms that I've coined, but I call it the pernicious persistent presumption. That's just my way of trying to be cute and
The
memorable. Maybe.
pernicious,
Pernicious persistent presumption. And
I
what
love it.
that is the presumption that even these complex challenges can be solved by the expert. And so they hire, and we all know who the big consulting companies are. You and I have dealt with them or worked for and with them and all of that. And we know people there, and they're good people and they mean well.
Absolutely. Yes.
But they are also being faced with the challenges and the pressures to make money and get clients and do stuff. And so promises come in business, and especially. So yes, I did this for them, and your problem is similar to their problem. That leads us, believe it or not, to gardening, which is what you mentioned,
Mhm.
and to farming. And there's a term, I don't know if you're a wine fan or a wine drinker at all. Do you like
I
wine?
do indeed. I
Oh,
do.
wonderful. Perfect. So you may know this word. Do you know the word terroir? Terroir. I think it's French.
No.
So it's a term that's used, if you look up about wine and wine growing, it's every little aspect of the environment in which those grapes are growing that makes that grape taste the way it does. And
Mhm.
it's the angle of the sun and the amount of sunlight and the soil and the pests that are there and the animals that do this and the nutrients that don't do that, and every little detail. And over time, the farmers there, just like you mentioned gardening, will learn and know more than the average person might ever see. But it isn't necessarily everything that can solve every issue. If it was, every wine would taste equally great. They don't. And so to me, we should be thinking about social terroir. What are the things in a business or a community's environment that are going on, that are making it what it is? There was a very, very well-known sort of self-taught, self-made, became very famous social observer of urban landscapes, Jane Jacobs. And, life and death of the great American city, she saw things that others didn't see, and in ways others didn't see them. So where there's challenge now in the complex challenges of our businesses, operations, communities, lives, there's also opportunity. And the opportunity comes from hearing and seeing and thinking in ways that we had not before. And so what then is the biggest obstacle? Well, we have the pernicious, persistent, presumption. And what is underneath all of this, in my experience, is one word, and that word is fear. We are afraid of failing. We are afraid of having to tell others we don't know the solution, or we don't know what to do. Whether it's you, the boss, the leader, the senior executive, you the president, you the whatever, wherever, in whatever context, and so we get constrained by our fear. And we are, in some cases, I have seen people as much afraid of success as they are of failure.
Absolutely.
Because
Absolutely.
if we succeed, oh my God, they're going to want me to do it again and again and again. And I don't know how I did it the first time, and so this happens. And so now then the question is, what then? Or what next? What else can we do?
Well, that leads me directly into the next thing I want to talk about, which is, for me, the next then is in fact has to come from many voices. And
Yep.
you have I know been a person who has used and has expertise in something called liberating structures. And I absolutely love the phrase, by the way, because it's a structure that liberates you. How can that be? It's almost like an oxymoron, but it's fascinating when you get into it. But I'm going to let you get into it, and then maybe make some comments as you go along.
I really appreciate that. Yes. So for those who are not familiar with this, I didn't coin this term or create this body of knowledge and practice, but two friends of mine and folks you may know also. Again, I met them through the Plexus Institute over 20 years ago. Henri Lipmanowitz was one of the founders and leaders of Plexus originally, and had worked at Merck Pharmaceutical, head of their international division, and Keith McCandless, who was a consultant and author out in Seattle. And I don't recall how Keith and Henri connected, but they did.
I will tell you that I am sure that it was Lisa Kimball.
Oh, no question. No question. The same way that you and I had to connect. Exactly. Everyone that we know who's really, really cool connected through Lisa Kimball, the greatest catalyst and connector I ever met in my life. Anybody worth knowing, Lisa knew them. This is true. This is true. And she is much missed.
Much missed.
And so liberating structures. So Keith and Henri had, knew some things about how this complexity stuff works. And they had seen facilitative methods and group methods and things that different folks would use, whether it was focus groups or interviews or brainstorming, things that are pretty common. And they thought, well, what else can we do? We know that there are ideas in this room that, for a variety of reasons, and fear being one that limits and inhibits expression. What can we do that would, literally, the word they use is unleash all voices, get every idea, and even some of the most far-fetched ones that folks might have thought, this couldn't possibly work. I won't say this because we would never put any effort in investment of time and money into trying that. And so again, the notion of liberating the creativity and the ideas and the ideation in the room. Structures comes from the fact that there are a very small, seemingly simple, if you look at it, they might even seem trivial or insignificant when you read this on the website. It's all open source for liberating structures. And if you read, all right, there's this activity, and I have to have a chair put a certain way, and you can talk this way, and then you have to turn your back on the people that are talking about you, which is one of them that you may know, Troika Consulting. It's a very popular one. Why does this matter? And it seems sometimes like that one almost silly. And yet, they found through their trial and error and their own work and practice with this, these are the differences that make the difference. And so the structures, as it were, are just very short, very simple ways of setting up these activities that make all the difference in the world.
Bruce, I have to tell you an example from my own life.
Please.
We're in a session being facilitated by Lisa herself, and we were in small groups of about 4. And you would talk about some idea that you had. And each person took a turn, but here was my turn. I sat and I talked about something I wanted to do. And I thought I was really clear and excited about this. And then they made me turn my chair around, face the other way. And the other 3 people talked about what they heard. Yes. Well, it was embarrassing to turn around. But when I started listening to them, I thought, oh my God, I said that. I didn't mean to say that, but I really like how they interpreted it. It was mind-blowing in terms of what it opened up for me. So that's an example.
Oh, that was wonderful. And And it's exactly that. And one of the other structures of that particular activity is that when you, and you're supposed to be the client and they're supposed to be your consultants, when you turn your back, you cannot speak or even
That's
move.
right.
They tell you to just sit still with your back turned
That's right.
as people are talking about you and about your situation as you have described it. And as you say, it is an incredibly powerful, that's a wonderful example of what liberating structures can do. And so, and you can even, there's a very simple kind of chart, as it were, that, all right, what are the kinds of challenges and issues that we're trying to address here? And then they match that up to different ones of the 30 plus liberating structures. And you can sort of put them together and say, all right, if we have a strategic planning challenge or a marketing challenge or a whatever it is challenge, could be the social challenge. What are we going to do about those folks that are under, huddled under the bridge, homeless at night? And what are we going to do now that we brought them into the shelter and we have fed and housed and clothed them? And now they're telling us they're sad because they miss their friends that they were with every night. A
Yeah.
true story, an unintended consequence of the complexity of it. Now, what can we do? And so liberating structures is a wonderful, again, free, simple, easy to learn, and fun, incredibly generative tool and technique that anybody could learn and use.
Yeah. What comes to mind is, those people who are watching are saying, well, if this thing is so complex, why is listening to more voices helpful? But in the end, whatever is the solution has to come out of human minds because we're the people who are going to do it. I think we diminish our capacity simply by saying, well, it can only come from an expert or something like that. Whereas, in fact, it really is the different perspectives that reveal what the issue is and the possibilities.
Understood and totally agreed. And you know, when we think about these issues of, again, it's complex, it's this, it's that, the things that constrain and limit us, like those structures, that's what also simultaneously enables us. There's a woman who I've had the pleasure of meeting once, Alicia Herrero. She was a philosophy professor, and she has a book, and it's all about the nature of constraints that may limit or prevent us from doing certain things, but simultaneously are enabling. They direct our thinking. The other thing I wanted to mention, getting to what you said, is, and I forget the source of the quote, I've got to track this one down, but I think it was a scientist who said that one definition of the complexity of a situation is how many coherent narratives can we tell about it? Which is
You have
to
to say
say,
that again, Bruce. You have to say that
sure,
again.
sure. So one definition of complexity of a situation
Mm-hmm.
is how many coherent narratives can be told about it. So, it's like we know these, probably know the story of the blind people and the elephant, and they all are experiencing it in their own unique way. And the one is so totally different and seemingly mutually exclusive from the other. For those who are not familiar with that, just Google the blind people and the elephant, you'll find it. And so what happens then when we've got a challenge that no expert seems to be able to solve? And when we get everybody in the room, as you say, and now we're hearing all these different thoughts. This person says, I think it means this. I think we should do this. The other one says, no, I don't see it that way at all. And I think you're wrong. And it's not that, it's this. And a third person says something different than the other two, and on and on and on. And so we need to be able to, one of the ways really to move these things forward that I use comes actually from my experience with win-win, as it's often called, or integrative is the term that's technically used, integrative negotiation. And I
And
know that,
Bruce, I'm going to interrupt you there.
yeah, because I know that's a word that has a lot of resonance for
It
you.
has a big resonance with me. Moreover, I want to hear the story, but we have to take a break now.
Let's do that. This is a good point to do that.
For everybody, just stay tuned because when we come back, Bruce will expand on that story and link back to some other things. So stay tuned.
Thanks.
Welcome back. You're listening to or watching Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair, and what we've been talking about today is this thing called complexity. It's kind of interesting because it's all around us. And the person that we're talking with is Bruce Waltuck. So, Bruce, I'm going to turn it back over to you to finish the story.
Oh, thanks, Madeline. Yeah, so we were talking before the break about the notion of integrative solutions and how then do we move forward when we've got all these people at the table or in the room with seemingly very different views about what it is, what it means, and what we should do. And as I like to talk in my way of sort of explaining that, how did people get to these different views? Why and how do they see things differently? And it's because of who and what we are and every moment we've lived up till that point. I ask people in meetings and I ask my students, so what are the two questions that every human being is trying to answer every moment we're alive? And I tell them their answers may not be the same as mine. There's no right or wrong. But my answers are, what does this mean and what are we going to do about it? It's what you and I are doing right now.
Right.
And so in that room, in that meeting, what are we going to do about this issue, this challenge, this situation? And again, the multiple perspectives. What then, and I learned this from, there's a very famous book still around after many decades, still very influential, Getting to Yes, by Bill Urey and his colleagues, Roger Fisher and others. And in there, they talk about, all right, you've got your ideas, you've got yours, they may be completely opposed, and you may not see any way forward. What then can we do? And what I was taught and what I work with groups on doing is to say, all right, we may not be able, if we try something, we try your idea or yours or mine, how are we going to assess that this worked and how are we going to compare this to what you thought? So that's another piece of it. But as we evaluate the different ideas, I was taught, and we can do this with small groups or any kind of group, what are the 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, whatever short list of key operating principles and values that we share, that we can reach consensus on? What's important to us in whatever it is we're going to do? Those then become the lens by which every option will be assessed. Does it meet our basic criteria? That also is a way of assessing, when it's hard to assess the outcome in a complex situation, the how many and how much, the easy quantified stuff that everybody, consultants and everybody else wants to count, managers, how well did we do? The how well question is the hard one. But one thing we can do if we're acting in this way through this lens is to say, did we do what we said we would do the way we would do it in terms of meeting and living up to our espoused values and principles? We use that then as a lens to assess and evaluate these multiple options and ideas. The other piece of this, which comes from a lot of the complexity research and many practitioners, is the idea of experimenting, exploring possibility in ways that are safe to fail. We are not afraid of failure. Again, that fear factor that I've seen again and again and again. And so can we try these things?
Yeah.
And we're going to learn as much if we fail as if from when we succeed.
As you were saying that, I kept thinking about one of the first management strategies, if you will, to deal with a complex situation is try something.
Yeah.
If it works, do it more.
Yep.
If it doesn't work, you shift to something else.
Exactly.
The other thing that came to me as you were talking about this, the idea of the many, many voices, it really gave me an insight into how this thing called complexity can actually invite us into creativity.
Oh, absolutely. Not only invite us, I would say it's always there, and we just aren't really necessarily hearing it or moving in that direction, and we need to, and we should.
Yeah. I wanted to say one other thing, somewhat divergent. You talked about the fact that we all have different perspectives on things. I'll never forget being in an audience one time when I think it was Ken Gergen who was officiating. And he said, now on this side of the audience, I want all of you to look at this beautiful auditorium as if you were the maid who had to clean it. And you on the other side of the audience, I want you to look at this beautiful auditorium and think about it as if you were a thief. What is it that you see? And then you began to hear what
Yes.
people saw in the same place.
Yes.
And you realized, oh my goodness, we really do have different perspectives.
Absolutely. And again, I learned when I began to read and watch videos about Jane Jacobs' work and this notion of kind of deep seeing, as it were. And again, it's all through the eye and the mind of the beholder, and can we learn to see differently and then respond differently? We talked before about the either or aspects. Well, is it this kind of challenge or that kind of challenge? And the reality is, simultaneously, it isn't either or, it's both and, as we know. And so there's some things that we're going to be dealing with, like, again, using that example of the folks homeless under the bridge. We can build a shelter, we can feed and house them, we can get them medical treatment, we can get them psychological treatment. Now we learn that there's something else that we didn't anticipate about their happiness. How now can we, what next? What else can we do? It's this and it's that. It isn't the either or. And so it's challenging to many of us because of these centuries of Newtonian, this is the lever and the magnet and the pendulum and whatever. We expect it to be this way or not that way. But when it's this pulling us this way, we're helping them over here. Now we have this other problem. What are we going to do? It's both and it's always both and our minds are not trained and equipped ordinarily to be simultaneously in that duality space, or whatever you want to call it. It's hard.
Ironically, that place, so you could call it the place of ambiguity, you could call it the place of paradox, as you described it, with multiple possibilities. That kind of capacity we resist simply because it's hard for our brains. And our brains are very efficient. It wants to do things the same way it did it before because that's efficient.
Yes.
But we have to work against that. That's why we have this frontal lobe that allows us to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that our habits are always efficient, by the way. I don't know that
our
they are.
habits are not. Our habits are
and
not.
so we may become entrained and accustomed to doing certain things in certain ways that are not necessarily optimal. And I see that happen a lot too. And I'm as guilty of that, by the way, as any human being who's ever lived.
Of course. But the efficiency I'm talking about is what's going on inside this brain. It always works for efficiency, for its energy, because it wants to keep its energy down. It takes so much.
Oh yeah, we're certainly working for our own comfort and convenience. And is it efficient and effective? Maybe, maybe not. But we certainly think that it is, and we want to believe that it is, for sure.
That's right.
For sure.
But what I was getting at was the irony is you can't be in a leadership perspective if you cannot deal with a certain amount of ambiguity.
I agree.
You don't even get on the short list for an executive position if you can't deal in ambiguity.
Should not. Should not and does not are not necessarily the same.
You're right.
I think again, this points back to the fear factor. That organizations, again, we all want and wish things were stable, predictable, and controllable. That's that Newtonian mindset. And we want it that way in business, and we want it that way in life, and all kinds of stuff, that we just, why isn't it this way anymore? My son just bought his first car that he bought on his own a couple of weeks ago. And in the midst of this current market, when you and I, every car we ever bought, it was how far below sticker price would we get. Now it's how much over do you have to pay?
That's right.
And literally the price went up $3,000 the day after he signed his deal.
Amazing.
Stuff happens, and we are in this turbulence and in this chaos and unknown and unknowability. And how then will we respond? Can we learn to stay calm? And the aspects, and I was just going to say one last thing quickly on that. It involves both the mind and the heart. It's our cognitive things and our affective things. Our emotions are a key factor.
That's right. Well, one of the practices that come out of my work on resilience is things that allow you to get to know who you are at every level. So you're right, because the stronger you are in terms of who you are, the stronger you are able to handle this ambiguous stuff. But speaking of which, now I have some recommendations to people to get themselves prepared. But many of our viewers are people who are really serious about their careers. Now you've opened up a Pandora's box for them. What do you recommend for them? How can they prepare themselves for this?
Great question. So the first thing I would say is just do a little bit. It doesn't take much. There are things you can read to get very great insights in 10 pages, as it were, about this complexity stuff. There are some really seminal papers in this field and discipline. The folks who kind of came up with some of this, what kinds of situations we're in and what is the optimal pattern of response. Originally, Cynthia Kurtz and David Snowden were working together when Dave was at IBM over in England. I happen to know both of them now for many, many years personally. And so there's a paper, and I think it was 2003 was the first paper. It's Kurtz and Snowden. In 2007, there's a very famous and influential paper, I think a prize-winning paper, that was in the Harvard Business Review that Dave Snowden is the lead author with Mary Boone, who I also met through Lisa Kimball. And you just had to say that. And so the Snowden and Boone paper, which is called The Leader's Framework for Decision Making, is an extremely well-known and influential piece that's very short and will give you some of these kinds of insights. I suppose I could put a plug in for myself. If you look up Bruce Waltuck's SlideShare, you'll see I have a presentation called The Problem with Problems, one that I've done for a number of different professional groups. And it's very much, if you just glance at the slides, you'll get some of the stuff that I've been talking about today.
Well, that's fabulous. You've given them so much to go and do some homework on.
just a little bit. Just a
little bit. But and I think that certainly goes consistent with what I advise, because when I look at or have found people who are really resilient, yes, they have a clear sense of who they are. But the second is they have some deep knowledge that they can use as a framework for understanding things. So my practice is to help you build that person to be understanding not just who you are, but your values and everything. So it's the affect as well.
And one other thing I just wanted to mention real quickly,
sure.
and it's something that a former colleague of mine, when I worked at a large regional transit organization near Philadelphia that operates the main bridges and rail line in and out of Philadelphia, my friend John got involved and really interested in improv and improvisation techniques. And we think of that sort of as a comedy kind of a thing, but he has taken improv techniques, and I know other folks who do this too, and apply it to this work of business and the complexities of it. My friend, and you may know, do you know Michelle James?
Yes, I do. She's a dear friend.
I figured you would.
She's been on the show.
There you go. I didn't notice that. I saw other folks I know who had been. Yeah. So, Michelle, for those who don't know her, takes this kind of technique and this stuff and applies it exactly through this lens in these ways that we're talking about. And so one of the things, and when I first formed with my two partners, the Liberating Structures group that we run in Philadelphia, we called it Yes and Philly, which comes explicitly from the core method of improvisation, which is yes, but, something, Madelyn, you mentioned earlier about the yes, but, and the yes, and. When we say but, it stops the flow of ideation and possibility. You're putting a limit and putting the brakes on possibility. But when I speak and say yes, and I leave it open for you, now the path is open for us to co-create that new thing. And John has brought that to the Port Authority and literally used improv to improve collaboration and leadership and organizational culture in 1,000-person organizations. So that's another point I would make. Go take an improv class or look it up or take a session with Michelle or whatever you do.
I had a marvelous guest on, David Fessel, and he talked about that, especially in relationship to humor, so that you could really open up all kinds of things. And humor, we are less afraid and fearful when we can laugh at something. And so he was really at both of those things. And we've talked about about improv on the show as well. And it's a
Wonderful.
great tool. It really is a great
I
tool.
think
And the thing is,
underappreciated in many ways, I think.
I agree. And a guy by the name of let's see, his first name is Bob. I have to think about what his last name is. Sadler. He talked about bringing it into an organization, an organization of scientists, where they just couldn't get their, it just
They're all siloed. It's
exactly,
blinders.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so he had them do improv, and he said it transformed the company. Absolutely transformed
So
them, because
interesting.
suddenly they started talking together about substantive stuff that could make the thing move forward.
You've given me a great idea there that I should have thought of. I have a dear friend that my longest friend in my life is a world-renowned genetic researcher in California. And he's much more open to this stuff, but his colleagues typically are not. And I should really tell that. And my friend has had a lot of involvement, believe it or not, with the TV and movie industry out there. When you watch Eddie Murphy's Nutty Professor, the lab is my friend's lab that they filmed and whatever. And so bringing improv into some of their meetings would be a great idea. I'll have to pass that one on. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. The wonderful thing about improv is that it creates a safe space where you can do these crazy things. Yeah.
Yeah. Similar in that way to liberating structures.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm glad we got that phrase in relationship
to
liberating
absolutely.
structures, because it's exactly what happens. You feel comfortable and safe. Well, I knew this conversation was going to be dynamite. I feel that it has been. But Bruce,
it's exploded a couple of times. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I have two more things for you.
Sure.
One is I want you to give you a little bit of time to give any closing comments from yourself to our audience. But I'm also curious. You've shifted your life before, and I'm just wondering, if you didn't have to sleep, how would you spend the?
I don't sleep much now.
Oh, darn. Well, I was going to say, how would you spend the extra 8 hours? But maybe it's only 6 or 4.
Well, that's okay. No, I can answer that, and it's a creative kind of a thing, actually. One of my longtime sort of sideline hobby activities. I've been a guitar player since I was 12, and I'm a songwriter, and I've written, I don't know, 80, 90 songs, whatever it is so far.
Wow.
And last year, before I was going to go in and do some other stuff, I actually booked a day in the recording studio and laid down about 20 tracks of just simple guitar rhythms and vocal tracks. And for my birthday earlier this month, my son and other family members organized, it was his idea, to chip in and buy me another day in the recording studio to go in and work more on these recordings. So if I had, all night, every night, I would probably be up at the recording studio working on making records or something like that.
Well, that was an unexpected response to that.
See, there you go. You don't know what you're going to get.
That's right. That's right. It shows a whole different dimension of you.
There you go.
So you still have a couple of minutes if you wanted to give any further comments too, because again, I so appreciate this.
Yeah, and I'll try to kind of put a little bit of closure to this thing. And I don't know, I was doing in Northern Virginia back in, I think it was 2011. And it was a really interesting, complex challenge. 2 companies in Alaska, both of whom were major government contractors in making and selling things to the federal government. Both happened to be of the Inuit indigenous culture in their backgrounds. And in this merger and acquisition, it turned out that they were from basically different groups or sects within that Inuit culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the values, one company in the chief executive's office, they literally had, Inuit values posted on the wall. And these were operating values that they considered to be essential to their venture. And so the challenge was, how then can, again, 2 seemingly very close organizations, now they're at odds and they were clashing, and how can we bring these folks into dialogue? And what I thought of at that time, and I use the same framework today, and it comes again right back to this word that you've mentioned and I've mentioned, which is integrative approaches. When I do work with groups and with people, I don't try to scare people off by talking about complexity and use all these big chaos. These are words that scare people. I don't want to tell you that you're acting through the lens of fear. but rather I try to talk about the possibility, because we know that, and Brene Brown has talked about this extensively. With courage comes vulnerability by necessity. You don't get the one without the other. And
Yeah.
so if we're going to explore the space of possibility, I use all right, all right, tell me what's going on. Tell me why it matters. Tell me how you would address it. Tell me who you need to be involved to make this happen. Tell me where and when you're going to do it. And then finally, tell me what next. How will you know how this worked out? That's the key, one of the key ones, because it's an iterative, ongoing process. And so in these ways, if we can generate and bring out these multiple coherent narratives, everybody's great and compelling story, what does this mean? And what might we do? And what might we try in a way with courage, understanding the vulnerability, without fear, but rather we're curious and we have a desire to know and a need to know and a need to get better outcomes together. How then can and will we do it? And the way forward to do it is not hard, but it does take that curiosity and courage. And I hope everybody will do it.
Curiosity and courage. I love it. Bruce, again, great appreciation for you being with me today.
My appreciation to you for this. I wouldn't have said what I said if you hadn't said what you said.
Thank you. I remember back in 1987 when James Gleick published his book, Chaos. It was an invitation to see that even when the universe is unpredictable, it is unpredictable in some curiously predictable and beautiful ways. As I absorbed his message, sort of like Bruce with the pendulum, I began to lose my fear of the unpredictable because I knew there was order within it. Losing that fear allowed me to explore and understand whole new ideas, which have served me very well over the years. As we pursue our careers, there are many moments when the paths before us offer so much, it's hard to make a single choice. I hope that today's talk with Bruce has helped you see that there are more possibilities, which is what we are always seeking here at Unlocked as we open possibilities. And as always, if you have a topic that you would like to hear more about here at Unlocked, write me at Madelyn@madelynblair.com. It's on the screen. I love hearing from you. And while we're thinking about topics, consider the possibility of being able to talk with me directly to explore a topic or ask a question. Would that be something that you would find valuable? And if so, what would you like that to look like? I want to hear voices, lots of voices. Let me know, because I'm currently designing possibilities and I want to find the best one, or the best few even, to do this for you. Next week, we'll be talking with Mark Samuel. Mark is the author of a book, Reimagining Teams. He's a transformative leader with over 30 years of experience in the business world. He's going to bring his insights about teams along with stories from his work. Be sure to put it on your calendar and join us on May 4 at noon on Eastern here on E360 TV and live stream on my YouTube channel. And I am hopeful that by then I'll have live streaming also on Facebook. Be sure to check my website, madelynblair.com/media, for news of this. Thanks for listening to this segment of Unlocked. Be sure to comment on social media about the show and what you gained from it. If you want to return to today's conversation, the archives are available at madelynblair.com/media. And if you haven't done so, do check out my book, Unlocked, on Amazon. Thank you for watching Unlocked. I'm your host, Madelyn Blair, wishing you infinite possibilities as you unlock your resilience.